All right, hello everyone. Welcome to New Energy Conversations with Early Career Energy Researchers. My name is Megan, and I am the Manager of Academic Initiatives at the Irving Institute for Energy and Society at Dartmouth College. And I'm excited to welcome everyone here today for the first talk of our winter season of the series. So for folks who are joining us for the first time, I'll give you just a little bit of background on this initiative. So the goal of the New Energy program is to connect, empower, and raise the profile of early stage researchers in energy and climate. And one way we do this is through this New Energy webinar series, which actually started during the pandemic, and it's continued since. We've hosted over 50 speakers, and it provides emerging scholars with the opportunity to share their work with broader audiences. And we also host an annual in-person New Energy Summer Summit that aims to increase the capacity of early stage energy and climate researchers to accelerate transitions to equitable and sustainable energy systems and a healthy climate via interdisciplinary scholarship and collaboration. And we're about to launch the details of our 24 summit very soon, so stay tuned on that. Just a quick note before we begin the talk. After the talk today, we'll have an opportunity for discussion. So please feel free to enter your questions for our speaker using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. And you can enter those at any time during the program, and we'll get to as many as we can after the presentation. All right, so I'm delighted to kick us off today by introducing our moderator for the session, Seamus Nolan. He is a Revers Center for Energy, Sustainability, and Innovation Fellow at the Tuck School of Business. And prior to Tuck, Seamus worked as a legislative aide to Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont as a member of his economic policy team. At Tuck, Seamus is co-chair of the Business and Politics Club and spends his free time hiking, biking, and skiing throughout New England. And Seamus is passionate about accelerating the energy transition through the development and utilization of coordinated strategies on the part of both public and private sectors. Over the summer, he'll be interning at Avangard, focusing on electric vehicle infrastructure strategy. Seamus has a BA in Geography and Political Science from Millbury College. So welcome, Seamus. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to turn it over to you now to introduce our speaker.
Great. Thanks so much. All right. Thank you to everyone who came through. I'm excited to moderate this talk. So I'll now introduce Tyler Hansen, who will be the person giving the talk. Tyler is a research associate with the Department of Environmental Studies, where he's advised by Professor Elizabeth Wilson. He received his PhD in economics from UMass Amherst and worked for 2 years as a postdoctoral researcher at the Technical University of Denmark. Dr. Hansen's research revolves around the economics, political economy, and governance of clean energy transitions, with a particular focus on offshore wind energy. Some of his current projects include a case study on the Danish energy islands to explore the challenges to governing green socio-technical transformations, the development of a supply chain approach for estimation of local economic benefits from wind energy, and stakeholder engagement in the offshore wind sector to specify key challenges for the U.S. offshore wind sector development. And now I'll turn things over to Tyler.
Great, thanks so much for the intro. So let me just share my screen. Okay. All right, so can you all see my screen? I hope.
Yes, looks great. Thanks, Tyler.
Great, thank you. So I'll go ahead and get started then. So our motivation for doing this research is quite simple. So we know that we need to rapidly transition away from fossil fuels towards clean renewables. And while the clean energy transition is happening, it's not happening fast enough. Goals and targets continue to outpace development and deployment. And transformative innovation policy has emerged in academic and policy circles as a promising path forward. So showing how governments can lead and foster new technologies, ideas, and institutions that are needed to solve grand societal challenges, including accelerating the development and deployment of clean energy. So in this paper, co-authored with Lena Kitzing at Technical University of Denmark, we apply one framework for transformative innovation policy. It's called mission-oriented policy to a case study, the first case study on the Danish energy islands, which is a massive, highly ambitious project led by the Danish government that has the potential to transform offshore wind deployment, as well as electricity transmission. And before delving into the research, I want to give a quick introduction to offshore wind energy, as well as the energy islands. So starting with offshore wind, there are 4 key characteristics of offshore wind that make it a potential game changer for clean energy transitions. First is scale. So globally, according to the International Energy Agency, offshore wind has the potential to generate 11 times the world's electricity demand in 2040, even after accounting for the expected demand increases from electrification. Second, location. So being located offshore, it does not compete for land with onshore renewables, and it's also located near densely populated coastlines. So about 40% of the global population lives within 100 kilometers of coastlines. And then third, strength and consistency. So like onshore wind, offshore wind is a variable resource, but it's significantly less so. Offshore winds are in general stronger and more consistent, which is very valuable for electricity and energy systems. And then lastly, cost. So offshore wind development in mature markets, so you can think Northern and Western Europe, as well as China, is competitive without subsidy from governments. And given that it's still a young industry, cost reductions are expected to continue. So the North Sea in Europe is putting offshore wind's potential to the test. The North Sea is where offshore wind originated and matured. It had some of the best conditions for offshore wind globally, with relatively shallow waters and strong winds, but also very amenable policy environments. As late as 2020, the North Sea accounted for 60% of global offshore wind capacity. With the rise of offshore wind in China, it's now at about 1/3 of global capacity, but this is still quite impressive for a relatively small sea basin. So in terms of how much capacity there is in the North Sea of offshore wind, at present, there are about 24 gigawatts installed, but North Sea countries want to scale this up massively, making the North Sea a, quote, green power hub for Europe. So they're targeting 120 gigawatts installed by 2030 and 300 gigawatts by 2050, so a more than 10-fold scale up. And to help put this in perspective, 300 gigawatts would be about 4 to 5 times total global offshore wind capacity today. And it's about 1/3 of the size of the entirety of the EU and UK electrical grids, including all generation sources. But even in the North Sea, where offshore wind has been very successful, deployment is still too slow to meet these targets. The current rate is about 3 gigawatts installed per year, but this needs to more than triple and get up to around 10 gigawatts or more per year. So the main problem, according to European transmission system operators and other transmission experts, is the conventional model of connecting offshore wind farms to onshore electrical grids, which is characterized by point-to-point or radial connections. This is where every single offshore wind farm is individually connected to the onshore grid, and that can be seen in this diagram. And this model simply can't support a 300 gigawatt scale up, and certainly not by 2050. And this is for 2 main reasons. So first, an absolute nightmare from a planning and permitting perspective. Modern offshore wind farms tend to be around a gigawatt or 1,000 megawatts in size. So 300 gigawatts means about 300 offshore wind farms, which means securing and connecting to 300 onshore grid connection points, as well as doing onshore grid upgrades to handle this, this massive inflow of offshore wind power. So these points of connection and upgrades are highly contested and notoriously difficult to actually get approved and implemented. And this is a problem everywhere, not just in Denmark or Europe, also in the US. Second, as nearshore wind farm areas are used up, projects need to move farther and farther out to sea. requiring high voltage direct current or HVDC lines, which is very costly to do for individual wind farms. And the solution, according to the North Sea Wind Power Hub in particular, so a collaboration of North Sea country transmission system operators, is the hub and spoke model. So this is where multiple gigawatts wind farms are built around and connected to an offshore transmission hub. This can be shown in the right side panel. So these hubs, also called energy islands, they're hybrid connections, meaning, first, they're connected to one or more onshore grids. They can also be connected to other energy islands. And those connections are hybrid, meaning that power can flow both ways. They not only can they take offshore wind power from the offshore wind farms to land, but they can also be used to interconnect various onshore grids. So transmit power from one onshore grid to an energy island to another onshore grid in a different country, making the European grid much more flexible, much more connected, which is itself potentially transformative for getting to net zero. So the 300 gigawatts scale up is not a guaranteed success under this model, but it becomes feasible because it's much better for planning and permitting, and it is cheaper for those far from shore offshore wind developments. So now moving to the Danish energy islands. This project was approved by Danish Parliament in June of 2020, and it's the first attempt at realizing the hub and spoke model of transmission connection. So the project consists of 2 energy islands or transmission hubs, 13 gigawatts of new offshore wind farms, and all of the associated transmission infrastructure. One island will be so it will actually be an artificial island built in the North Sea, the green circle on the map, with a capacity target of 3 gigawatts by 2033, scaled up to 10 gigawatts around 2040. What does this actually look like, an artificial island? We don't yet know. However, one possible design is this. And what we see here in the upper left, the transmission equipment for the initial 3 gigawatts, and then the extension area able to scale up to the 10 gigawatts. And then across the bottom, we have the helicopter pad, operations harbor, accommodation facilities so people can stay overnight, and then power to X and electricity storage systems. So power to X is the conversion of green power to hydrogen and other chemicals. And these are part of the innovation zone that Denmark included in the North Sea island. So they want the islands to be testing grounds for the development of these new technologies, even beyond the innovation of the hub and spoke concept itself. So the other island will actually be built on the existing island of Bornholm, which is inhabited, has a population of 40,000 people. And it's actually in the Baltic Sea with a targeted capacity of 3 gigawatts by 2030. So offshore wind is less developed in the Baltic Sea, but there are plans in Europe to scale this up as well, though not quite as much as the North Sea. It's also important to note that Denmark is a relatively small country, a population of 5.8 million, similar to that of Minnesota. So this is a massive project for Denmark, given its size, especially with an estimated cost of around 40 billion US dollars. It can produce 2 to 3 times the electricity Denmark actually needs. So this makes international cooperation vital. So Denmark is working with other countries like Germany and Sweden to build transmission connections from the islands to their onshore grids. Okay, so now getting into the research that we actually did, where we applied this mission-oriented policy framework to the energy islands. I'm going to get into the methods and then go through some of the results, most importantly, the challenges for governance, and then some implications. So first, a little background on the mission-oriented innovation policy literature. So mission-oriented scholars generally position the approach as a sharp contrast to conventional economic thinking on innovation, which they argue is still quite influential in governments. And conventional economic thinking conceptualizes innovation as something that happens through private actors interacting in well-functioning markets. And this limits the role of governments to mostly fixing market failures. Mission-oriented innovation policy puts forth an interventionist government that goes well beyond market fixing, providing direction and leadership, research and development, and strategic investments in fostering transformative innovation, which we can define as the process of developing and implementing new ideas that lead to structural societal change. So the mission-oriented approach is empirically based in some of the most transformative technological innovations over past decades. So the archetypical case is the US Apollo moon landing mission that sent humans to the moon. There's also jet aviation, the internet, the cost reductions we've seen in solar and wind, and many more. And the contemporary literature is trying to apply lessons from these past successes to new socio-technical challenges, such as the clean energy transition. And so our research is one of a handful of emerging studies applying this approach to contemporary challenges. It's usually applied to a more general policy agenda. So we are applying it to a more concrete project where we can then focus in on that process of trying to implement it. So translating this into a framework for our case study, mission-oriented innovation policy can be broken down into two main parts. First, the government establishes a mission, which is a concrete objective or set of objectives that help to solve some societal challenge. Second, government directs public resources and capabilities to foster bottom-up solutions. So solutions from industry, academia, civil society. And part one is about providing a direction for future economic growth. And then part two, catalyzing activity that wouldn't otherwise happen. So for us, the framework sets our theoretical starting point. So governments have this massive role to play in doing transformative innovation. And this is very important for the Danish energy islands, which is itself a government-led project. But the idea itself was developed in state-owned transmission system operators. It's highly ambitious and potentially transformative. The framework also guides us in our where to look for challenges to moving this project forward. So for this, we identified 5 general areas from the literature that are important in shaping whether transformative innovation policy is successful. So first, we have defining and specifying the mission, which should be concrete, widely relevant, ambitious, but realistic. Second, policies, regulations, and public investments should co-create and tilt markets in the direction established by the mission. Third, risk-taking and rewards sharing. So transformative innovation requires making huge, risky investments with long time horizons, something that we don't even see in venture capital, which is unlikely to do this for until years, if not decades, of government investment. And because in doing transformative innovation, there will be failures along the way, it's also important to share in some of those monetary rewards to better absorb any failures. Fourth, activities need to be regularly evaluated and updated using tools that are suited for transformative innovation. And then lastly, the public sector needs to engender the capabilities necessary to deliver on the first four areas and ultimately implement the project in question. So we conducted 15 semi-structured interviews, each approximately 1 hour long with 14 participants. They represent 4 general areas of expertise. You can see this in the first column. So governance and implementation, technical development, private sector development, as well as economics. We focused on those most involved in implementing the project. So most important, the Danish Energy Agency charged with leading the project, and Energinet, Denmark's transmission system operator, charged with developing the electrical infrastructure. We also talked to engineers and inventors with technical expertise, private sector players that are planning to take part in the competitive auctions or tenders that will determine who will develop the artificial island, as well as the offshore wind farms. And then in addition to interviews, we also reviewed the relevant political agreements, government documents, news media, as well as scholarly and gray literature. So now I'm going to get into the results and start with why Denmark is doing the energy island, so the motivations as well as the key actors, just to provide a little bit more context. So based on interviews and the political agreements, there are 5 key motivations. So first, we have climate change. Second, maintaining Denmark's status as a global leader in wind energy technologies. Third is profits. Fourth, additional green innovation, even again beyond this hub and spoke concept, so power to X, electricity storage. And then lastly, energy security, a motivation that was added after Russia invaded Ukraine. And then we have the key actors. So I already discussed Energinet and the Energy Agency. You also see the Ministry of Finance. So they are essentially a gatekeeper for getting state funds. They declined to an official interview, but we were able to have some informal communications with them. And then Parliament wrote and passed the initial political agreement establishing the energy islands as a project. And then they periodically will amend that. And then the private co-owner of the North Sea island. So this will again be selected in a competitive tender. The winner will construct the artificial island and co-own it with a 49.9% minority share. The state will have the majority 50.1% share because it's considered critical infrastructure. And then finally, the developers building the offshore wind farms. So we identified 6 key challenges for governance, and I'm going to focus on the first 2, which are most important right now, and then briefly go through the others before getting into the implications. So our first challenge is securing enough resources, and this is best captured by a couple quotes from participants at the Danish Energy Agency. So for all of the quotes that I include in the presentation, you'll see some emphasis, bold, and increased font. So this is all emphasis added by me just to highlight the key parts. So let me give you 5 or 10 seconds just to read through these. Okay, so Parliament approved the vision, but not the resources. And to get the resources, the Energy Agency needs to use the resources it does have to continually struggle in these negotiations with the Ministry of Finance. It's only after this that they can go to the politicians to get final approval. Unsurprisingly, the Energy Agency has really struggled to move the project forward at the pace required by the political agreements. Most notably, we see the tender for the North Sea island has already been delayed over 2 years and is currently in limbo. There's no actually schedule for when it's going to come out. In late 2022, the Energy Agency did finally get a fairly large disbursement, so 498 million Danish kroner, or about 70 million US dollars. And according to participants, this helped immensely. However, once they got the resources and could look into the things they needed to look into, they realized that it was more complicated and that they would need additional resources. So this challenge has not been solved. So we also looked into how much the energy islands will cost and how these costs are distributed to help put this resource challenge into perspective. So based on a study commissioned by the Energy Agency, the energy islands are expected to cost about $39 billion over the course of about 20 years, so 1.9 billion per year. This is 7 times the cost of the Great Belt Bridge, which is Denmark's largest completed infrastructure project, or 3 to 4 times the annual cost, as this was a 10-year project. It's also important, though, to look at the share of costs that will be paid by each actor, because unlike a lot of infrastructure projects like the Great Belt Bridge, the government is not going to foot the entire bill. So most of the costs will actually be paid for by private developers developing the offshore wind farms, as well as Energinet developing the transmission infrastructure. And while Energinet is state-owned, they generate their own income and do not actually rely on taxpayer money. So the state, using taxpayer money, is directly responsible for 50.1% of the construction costs of the artificial island in the North Sea. So this comes out to just 2% of total project costs. However, economic analyses have found that they're likely also going to have to help pay for some of the offshore wind developments. Potentially more than that, there are all these risks with it being a new, highly uncertain project. So what we do is we just assume that the state will pay up to 20% of everything else: the offshore wind farms, the transmission infrastructure, the private co-owners' share of the artificial island. And if this happened, then they would be responsible for up to 22%, or about 1/5 of total project costs. So while it is a massive project, the portion paid by the state is quite a bit smaller. And then the cost data doesn't look specifically at those initial resources requested by the Energy Agency to really lead the project, get it going, write the tender material, do the stakeholder engagement, develop the regulatory framework. So if we do include all these disbursements, so far that the Energy Agency has received, it amounts to about 1/4 percentage point of the full $39 billion in infrastructure costs. So that could be quadrupled. It would only be 1%. And it also amounts to just 0.5% of a single year of government spending in Denmark. So those are relatively small amounts when you look at it in relative terms like that. Okay, so then getting to the underpinnings of this resource challenge, participants pointed to 2. So first, the triumph of business-driven over vision-driven resource allocation. The Ministry of Finance is business-driven, so they want to see a positive business case, meaning an analysis of all of the expected cash flows, showing that revenues will exceed costs. And they succeeded in getting this into the political agreement. This is something that the Ministry of Finance often pushes for, according to participants. So the energy islands are conditional on profitability. And while this is vague, it's currently being interpreted as a positive business case for the Danish state itself. Second, so then getting into the vision-driven approach, Energinet and the Energy Agency are more vision-driven. And so what this means is while they concede that the energy islands might not be of net societal benefit for a while, a decade or more, they argue that these benefits will come in the next phases. So as the hub and spoke concept is built out, offshore wind massively scaled up, helping to bring about this broader clean energy transition. So the economics are still important, but it's much more long-term. It's much more driven by these transformative potentials. So high risk, high reward. And then this gets into the second underpinning. So conventional methods to calculate the business case are simply not capable of incorporating this broader vision and the transformative potentials. So here is another quote from Hannah Storm Edlison, the head of Energy Islands at EnergyNet. Let me again give you 5 to 10 seconds to read through this. Okay, so the argument she's making, if you compare the energy islands, which have this big transformative potential, but are also completely new, highly uncertain, and are very long-term, if you compare this to what Denmark usually does, business as usual, radially connected offshore wind farms, as well as onshore renewables, then you will certainly get a negative business case. So the comparison itself doesn't make sense, is what she's arguing. And then participants also noted that some transformative potentials that or benefits that could be monetized, so patenting new technologies, building and exporting expertise and supply chains, these are excluded because they are simply too uncertain. And so these profitability concerns, it's important to note, are arguably the biggest challenge right now, keeping the energy islands in limbo, especially for, again, that North Sea island where the tender is not even scheduled right now. Okay, so the second challenge is also about resources, but it's about translating resources into a capable governance workforce, which is not necessarily a given, even if the energy agency gets the resources they need. And this is really a challenge for the energy agency. So according to participant 1, this simply did not happen. They did not get they were not able to hire the people with the right areas of expertise, et cetera. So let me again give you a few seconds to read this. So the main reason underlying this is public sector salary caps. So salaries of individual government employees are capped, as is the share of the overall budget that can go towards salaries. So an example is a skilled engineer working at the energy agency, making about half of what they would at a private developer like Ørsted. These caps don't apply to external consultants, so we see a very high usage of external consultants, leading to additional challenges. So every consultant is another interface to manage. The people at the consultancies working on the energy islands often change. And then right now there's about half of full-time employees at the energy agency being external that are working on the energy islands. And the energy the leadership has said that it's really struggled to build up their organization. All right, so then 4 additional challenges. I'll go through these briefly before getting into implications. First, overheated global supply chains. This is a problem everywhere, but threatens delaying the project further. The 4th challenge, the timeline. So meeting the politically determined timeline, in particular, balancing urgency with quality, cost effectiveness, and social acceptance. 5th, within EnergyNet and the energy agency, there is a struggle to make progress in an environment that is characterized by high levels of uncertainty and social and political contestation, where things can change very quickly. And then finally, because the project will produce more power than Denmark needs, we again need this international cooperation. Some progress has been made, but participants noted this has also been a challenge. Okay, so I'm going to conclude by going through 3 key implications from our research. We'll start with implications for the energy islands. So here again is our framework. Here are the challenges. And first, we see that the government committed a vision, but again, not the resources necessary to realize it. Most recently, the Energy Agency actually dissolved the Center for Energy Islands at the Energy Agency. So the employees and responsibilities were redistributed throughout the agency. So this doesn't mean that they are abandoning the energy islands, but it certainly does not bode well for the project, especially the North Sea Island. So based on our research, we can provide some general recommendations for how to go about making the decision on whether to commit resources. First, to make this well-informed decision, the Danish state needs to equip the Danish Energy Agency with the necessary resources and capabilities to investigate the risks, transformative potentials, etc. So again, while the cost of the full project is huge, the government's portion is small, and then the portion necessary for the Energy Agency to look into these things is even smaller. It may also require some kind of workaround solution to these public sector salary caps. So second, transformative innovation generally requires governments to take these big long-term risks and investments that the private sector won't. So also evaluation requires tools capable of accounting for that transformative potential, the bigger vision. So the government needs to reconsider the business-oriented approach to resource allocation, as well as conventional business case analyses, at least in the case of the Danish energy islands. So our second implication, we see a big need for more mission development. So this is for a couple of reasons. First, the parts of the mission that are well-defined are technological. So building energy islands, transmission infrastructure, and offshore wind farms by particular dates. But unlike the Apollo moon landing mission and other technological innovations, the main challenges are not technological. Our engineers and inventors that we interviewed stated this explicitly. So there are some technological challenges, but these are actually small and can no doubt be overcome. The biggest challenges are social, so economic, political, the governance process. And the mission really should be centered on these biggest challenges. And then if you recall, Denmark has 5 main motivations for doing the energy islands. So climate change, leadership, innovation, energy security, and profits. The first 4 demand urgency, doing something new and big and trying to do it quickly. But it's unreasonable to have these expectations, and also expect to make profits, at least in the short to medium term, which seems to be what they want. So incorporating the social challenges into the mission and then better specifying and prioritizing the underlying reasons for doing the energy islands and the desired outcomes in a way that's realistic could go a long way in helping to provide guidance on solving all of these challenges. And then lastly, we were also interested in the usefulness of the mission-oriented framework, as it is still emergent, and it's still working towards making that jump from technological to socio-technical projects. And we found the framework very useful in helping to guide conversations with participants, identifying challenges, as well as providing some general guidance on paths forward. What it can't do yet, and this is not unexpected, is provide the more specific recommendations that can help solve particular challenges. So doing early stage resource allocation, what the best policy and project evaluation tools are, and how to develop this socio-technical mission where we had these social challenges that are much bigger than the technological. So future research in these directions has the potential to improve the practical usefulness of this framework. Okay, so that does it for the presentation. Thanks so much for listening. I look forward to questions and comments.
All right, great. Thank you, Tyler. So folks, I would be happy to open up the Q&A portal for questions now. Feel free to just type those in, or if folks need us to get started over here, we can do that as well. As folks type this in, Tyler, I can start us off with a question.
Sure.
So as the US is starting to build out its offshore wind infrastructure, we're obviously quite a ways behind Denmark is. What sort of lessons do you think we can learn from this case study that you've done, and what can we learn more broadly from what Europe is doing on offshore wind?
Yes, so there's that. Yeah, so the U.S. is at a very early stage of offshore wind development. There are just a handful of operating offshore wind turbines in just the tens of megawatts today. And the goal is to get 30 gigawatts by 2030, as well as ambitions up to maybe 150 gigawatts by 2050. And so we really need to develop this new industry. And so I think it's also in a way, it's transformative innovation, and the transformative policy frameworks can also be applied to building new sectors, like biotechnology is one sector that comes up in the literature as something where we see this mission-oriented approach. One thing that's a little bit different in the US, so in Denmark, they have this one-stop shop, they call it, for offshore wind. So it was interesting doing this where everyone directs you to the energy agency. They're like, everything goes through the energy agency. So they're the ones that are in charge of the approval process. In the US, we have the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management, BOEM, FERC. We have at the state level, different energy and environmental agencies. There's all kinds of agencies that need to coordinate together to do this. So that's definitely a big challenge, all of these interfaces. But yeah, so I think that the key is to figure out what are the key challenges for the US. One of the challenges is building up the supply chain. So the supply chains right now are in Europe, in Asia, and with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we also see in Europe, this is something that participants talked about, everyone wants to go green much faster, putting even further strain on supply chains. So then in the US, it's very hard to get the supplies needed to move projects forward. It's also hard to develop the factories here quickly. So yeah, there's a lot of challenges that I think this approach could be useful for.
Great. And I had another question just come in from Jeff. He wanted to know about the hub and spoke system, and is that something that would be applicable to the US as it sort of builds out its northeastern wind farm area, or are they a little too close to shore for that to be needed?
Yes, that is a good question. Let me just go back to the transmission connection slide. So there is, this is definitely relevant well beyond Europe, and it's a little bit different along the East Coast where, it's all the states are adjacent to one another, rather being surrounding the sea. But there actually is a lot of talk of doing the hub and spoke concept, or it's often called a meshed offshore grid. So again, it's all about being able to, do multiple wind farms connected to a single transmission hub. And then that transmission hub is able to actually increase onshore flexibility because power can travel both ways. So there is definitely a lot of potential for that. I remember seeing in the news, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago, there was some kind of decision made on offshore wind transmission in New Jersey. And some people were disappointed that they didn't see more of this hub and spoke concept. So there is a lot of talk about it. And it's something that I'm planning to look into now that I'm back here in the US and going to start focusing more on US offshore wind.
And a question coming in from Amanda. She was wondering more about the Bornholm Island, and to your knowledge, have there been any conversations between folks thinking about Bornholm versus this island that needs to be built from the ground up and building offshore wind further into the Baltic states?
Yeah, so another project that I did while in Denmark was with a couple sociologists as well as an engineer. We spent a week on Bornholm and did interviews with all these different stakeholders there, including just people, just citizens on Bornholm, to see what they thought, and then also talking to Energinet and different stakeholders or actors from the government to get their perspectives. And when you talk to the government actors, they say, we've done lots of stakeholder engagement. People are generally excited about making Bornholm a transmission hub. And there has been engagement, but when you talk to people on Bornholm, they say, yes, we are excited about the prospect of being an energy island, but in order to make sure it benefits us, we have to really fight tooth and nail for it. And the best example is so this is this is from the top down. So the government, the parliament said we're going to do this. The Bornholm doesn't have a lot of power in actually stopping it, though of course with enough resistance they can make it much harder to move the project forward. So they weren't actually planning on including a cable from the transmission infrastructure on Bornholm to Bornholm's grid. Right now, Bornholm has just the single cable to Sweden, and sometimes there are problems and they might get blackouts for a day or two. And so it seems like a really no-brainer to do that, to make sure that the local community is benefiting. So that's something that you see on Bornholm that you obviously don't see as much with the North Sea Island. Of course, there are other stakeholders, the fishing industry, shipping industry, and then the communities that are going to be near the onshore connection points for the North Sea Island. But on Bornholm, we see that it's obviously much different when you're trying to develop this infrastructure, which is bigger than anything Bornholm residents have seen, in a place that's inhabited. So it is a great central location, but it does lead to these additional challenges of social and political acceptance.
Interesting. Sort of to double click on stakeholder engagement more generally, are there ways in which processes have been formalized in Denmark through which offshore wind developers or transmission line constructors need to deal with or take into account the views of stakeholders like there is in the United States, or is it a little more freeform and there's less say from those stakeholders?
There are processes. So going back to Bornholm, one thing that is required is you see, so where the transmission equipment will be, there are a few homes and properties that will have to be basically taken over by the government. And so the government goes and talks to them, and they can get input on where to put, like there's been, all kinds of discussions on, okay, where does it make sense to put the transmission infrastructure? And then the people that it does impact, there is a process for saying, okay, we're going to compensate you. So there's that. In terms of stakeholder engagement from the Danish Energy Agency, that was actually one of the things that they said was really hard because of the lack of resources. And so their engagement became much more reactive. And so you have the stakeholders that have a little bit more power, ability to, make their voices heard, like the Danish Federation of Industries. They make some kind of complaints or critiques, and then the energy agency reacts to it. So that was one thing. And then the formal process, there's a formal process of doing these market dialogues where they bring in different offshore wind developers, potential contractors, and get that input. And so they did that, but the input from regular citizens is lacking a little bit, even though there are some processes for that.
Great. And it seems we've got one last question coming through in the chat. Jeff would like to know what your views are on sort of the recent cancellations by Ørsted of two of its projects, Ocean Wind 1 and 2. There have been a number of others in the Northeast in the US. And the stated reasons that they had were supply chain and interest rates. What sort of policy options do you see as mechanisms for overcoming these challenges, or do you see it continuing to be a problem moving forward?
Yeah, so we have an undergraduate student right now who's working on this exact question of like what is going on the East Coast right now with all these projects either being canceled in these cases or sort of being in limbo and really being like, hey, we can no longer make the economics work. And so in general, we see contracts. So in most states, there's a competitive process by which offshore wind developers who have secured a lease off the East Coast, they then need to create this offtake agreement with utilities. So the utility agrees to buy electricity from the offshore wind farm at a specified price. And so in the auctions, they state the lowest price that they can sell that electricity for. And so these offtake agreements were created earlier on, either before the pandemic or right at the beginning of the pandemic, before we saw this extreme inflation and supply chain issues globally. And so that's often what developers are saying is we made this agreement and now it no longer makes sense. And so there needs to be some learning in how to do those contracts. So there are ways by which you can say, hey, let's make sure that we index for inflation. It's not, it won't solve everything because we've also seen offshore wind costs have gone up substantially more than general inflation, but that's one way to go about it. And then, yeah, so supply chains, that there needs to be a way to develop some domestic supply chains, because again, we have this problem where it's really hard for companies developing on the East Coast to be able to access those international supply chains, which are already stressed and have plenty of business in Europe, in Asia. So yeah, I'll stop there, but yeah, there's a lot more. It's definitely an interesting, feel free to reach out to me to discuss this more.
Great. I think we are reaching toward the end of our time here. Tyler, any last words that you want to leave us with?
I don't think so. I guess, yeah, so I think we kind of touched on where I'm going. So this is research that I did in Denmark when I was there for 2 years, the Technical University of Denmark, their Department of Wind and Energy Systems. And now here in the US, I'm working with Elizabeth Wilson, and we're really trying to learn from Denmark, learn from Europe, but also figure out what can't be learned and what needs to be newly developed here to get this offshore wind sector going in the US.
Great.
Great. Thank you so much, Tyler. And thank you so much, Seamus, for moderating a great discussion. This was really fantastic. Thank you, Tyler. It was wonderful to have you, and welcome to Dartmouth. We're glad to have you here.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Yes. So before we close, I'll just share with you our upcoming new energy talks. So we have coming up Kingren Lee, who's an assistant professor at Clarkson University, and she'll be speaking on February 14th, talking about her work in local benefits of electric vehicle charging stations in terms of increased revenues for businesses that are near newly established charging stations. And then on Wednesday, March 6th, we'll have Ben Viraga, who will be talking about his work in trade-offs among cost, efficiency, and emissions in a northeastern urban energy system, incorporating renewable sources and storage solutions. So looking forward to both of those talks. And thank you again so much to Tyler for joining us and to Seamus for moderating today. And for more information, you can go to go.org/new energy, where you can register for our upcoming talks and also find out information about our upcoming New Energy Summer Summit, which will be happening this July. All right, thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.